All right. Uh, so welcome to this lecture, um, comparative modeling in socionics. I think that probably if I was paying more attention when I made this event, I should not have called it this. But by all means, we can talk about various different models. I intend for this lecture to be. I prepared some slides to talk about some different modeling in socionics, but I intend for this lecture to be quite informal and quite conversational with audience questions. I'm interested in knowing about what you want to know. But the thing that I was really asked to prepare, or that seemed to garner some interest in the previous lecture, was a lecture about my own modeling. So I'll do that. My own modeling is Western, and we'll talk about what that means. Western socionics is, in my view, the idea that socionics is largely a theory of quadras. This differs from my modeling in terms of being entirely a theory of quadras. So my modeling I'm calling a theory of quadras. Western socionics is a broader school, which I am a part of. Western socionics is a term that was made up by Ibrahim Tensor, who is also in Western socionics, and we had a little disagreement, he and I and other people, about what this term means. I asked Ibrahim if he thought that the idea that socionics is largely a theory of quadras is a good summary, and he disagrees. Instead, he provided this definition. We use quadra values more than other schools, but I do not agree that this all means we see it as largely a theory of quadras. Instead, Western socionics is the understanding of socionics used by theorists in the English-speaking community who learn directly or indirectly from Rick DeLong. This is, in my opinion, very stupid. This is not a very good or descriptive way of explaining anything that Western socionics stands for, because how many of you guys know Rick DeLong? You might have heard me talk about Rick DeLong on occasion, but none of you guys know Rick DeLong. This doesn't tell you anything about what Western socionics actually is, whereas my explanation, Western socionics is largely a theory of quadras. It's a school of socionics that uses quadra values and quadra themes more than other schools. This is a pretty simple summary that's conceptual, that's specific, doesn't require you to know anything about Rick DeLong. It doesn't require you to know anything about what the socionics community looked like in 2007. So I just wanted to mention this because Ibrahim Tensor made this term, but I'm going to consider Western socionics the idea that socionics is largely a theory of quadras and ignore this stuff about learning from Rick DeLong. My modeling of socionics I'm calling a theory of quadras. A theory of quadras is the idea that socionics is entirely a theory of quadras, which is correspondingly more Western than Western socionics. It's the most Western in some way of thinking about it, because Western socionics is basically the idea that socionics is 70% or something like that, a theory of quadras, and 30% other stuff, other modeling. And my view is that the other modeling doesn't exist, and that we should be focusing only on the quadra themes. And this has been a drum that I've been beating for a long time. I'll speak a little bit more about the formulation of what this means. But here are some things that are included is common socionics concepts in the theory of quadras. Model A is inherently part of the theory of quadras, and Augusta's idea about intertype relations are inherently part of the theory of quadras. Augusta had these ideas about intertype relations, that people from the dual pairs are better than other relationships, and she had a much more specific system of intertype relations, which I'm her version is the hard intertype relations. My view is soft intertype relations, which I discussed in the last lecture, where her explanation about this how specific intertype relations are is much too specific and trivially falsifiable, but intertype relations start with quadra values. Perhaps people with similar values have a more higher likelihood of being interpersonally compatible, of being friends, especially in being friends in situations where there is random assignment. People are randomly assigned to live together. And so this is a very quadral idea because all of Augusta's intertype relations are based on quadras, the idea being that people in the same quadra have better, more compatible values, and people of different quadras have less compatible values. Here are some things that are not part of the theory of quadras. And there is a lot of them. Dimensionality is not part of the theory of quadras. Dimensionality we'll talk about more. Because dimensionality is included in Western socionics. Virtually everything else in this list is not part of Western socionics either, except for dimensionality. So Riemann dichotomies have nothing to do with the theory of quadras. Quadra progression has nothing to do with the theory of quadras. Despite having quadras in the name, it's some really different set of ideas that aren't related to the themes that I'm talking about. Subtypes are not part of any model by definition. DCNH is not subtypes by definition. Subtypes by definition are subcategories of types, which DCNH is not. It's a semi-independent subsystem. So I'm taking a page from the Enneagram book and calling them DCNH variants instead of subtypes. Function charges are not part of the theory of quadras. We will talk a little bit more about function charges. Gluyenko's cognitive styles, Gluyenko's romance styles, visual identification, energy flow along supervision and benefit rings, none of these have anything to do with quadra themes, and I use none of these concepts in my own modeling. Some more things that you may or may not have ever heard of. These are somewhat more obscure ideas in socionics. They're also not part of the theory of quadras. Introverted socionics. This is some ideas from Semyon Churyumov that probably none of you have ever heard of. Associative socionics, which is Olga Tangeman's color ideas that no one cares about, except for Olga Tangeman, is not part of the theory of quadras. Schulman's periodic system of the socion is Grigory Shulman invented some distance metrics between types that don't make any sense. They have nothing to do with the theory of quadras. Alexander Bokalov has some ideas about how type forms in infancy or in the womb. This has nothing to do with the theory of quadras. Viktor Talanov has function activation thresholds in Model T, nothing to do with my modeling here. Model L, which is Kimani White's work, nothing to do with this. Model X, this is also something that no one here has ever heard of. Model X by Ashton Boone and Stephen Wells and Sarah, I'm not sure if I know Sarah's last name, nothing to do with anything here. Meged and Ovcharov have ideas about how types are masks. That has nothing to do with anything. Cross type, super socion is work from Anthony Caudill. Smilexian socionics is from this guy, Smiling Eyes. These are old people in the socionics community from a decade ago, over a decade ago. All of these are obscure ideas. And none of these things have anything to do with the theory of quadras. Both of all of the concepts on both of these pages are inherently different, and in my modeling, they do not appear at all. Does anyone have any questions at this time? I encourage, as I said, I envision this presentation being informal in nature, and if people have questions, I hope that you will ask them, and we can talk about the questions that you have instead of all the things that I've prepared. But if not, then this will be a short lecture, and I'll go through the things that I've prepared if anyone has questions. Okay. Um, the presence cube is a somewhat formal representation in Western socionics of uh, how much of socionics is quadras and how much is not quadras, specifically dimensionality. So the presence cube is modeling that was made by Ibrahim Tensor, and it uses this geometric representation of this cube, which is displayed isometrically, and the there are two dimensions of there are three different dimensions of the cube. The cube is a three-dimensional object, and two of the dimensions represent quadra priority and dimensional strength. So there's quadras on one axis, and the other axis is dimensionality. And these are separated into orthogonal, non-overlapping components. And the third axis of the cube represents function strength. And the different functions are laid out on this cube in such a way that they add to dimensional strength, the theory of Yermak and Bukalov's from the mid-90s, along with the quadra dimension, which Tensor invented and called priority, and he lays them out this way. And this is a useful formulation because this is the most common the most common form of Western socionics, is that Western socionics is largely a theory of quadras, but also a theory of dimensionality. And again, my modeling ignores the dimensionality component. More specifically, and Tensor and I have discussed, and he recommends this modification and seems to imply that he uses this in his own work, is not the presence cube, but the presence rectangular prism, where there is an orthogonal dimension of dimensionality and there is an orthogonal dimension of quadra priority, of quadra values, but the quadra values component is weighted more heavily. And so I developed this quite simple mathematical modeling where the function strength is equal to the dimensional strength plus the priority strength, but the priority strength has some, or one of the two axes that are orthogonal has a coefficient. I actually gave the coefficient to the dimensional strength, and the coefficient is less than 1. And this, we'll talk a little bit more about this, how this modeling compares to some other modeling later. But this model, the presence rectangular prism, rather than the presence rectangular cube, the presence cube, is really, in my view, what Western socionics modally is. If you talk to most people that follow or write about Western socionics, the three major authors in Western socionics probably are myself, Ibrahim Tensor, and Jack Aaron. And my view is that of the three of us, the modal model is the presence rectangular prism. Both Ibrahim Tensor and Jack Aaron use something like this, where they have they look at, in their typing work, the influence of quadra values, but they also look at dimensionality and talk about dimensionality in their typing work, whereas I do not talk about dimensionality in my typing work. The only time when I talk about it is when people ask, and I tell them I do not believe that dimensionality exists. But other people have read the works from Tensor and Aaron and watched Aaron's YouTube videos on WSS, and he does not call it the presence cube. Tensor invented the presence cube and calls it the presence cube, but I'm calling what Jack's modeling is as the presence cube as well, because he basically does the same thing. He uses more quadras than he does dimensionality, which makes him Western, but he also uses some other concepts like dimensionality. He uses some other concepts too. Recently, he's been referring more to Riemann dichotomies, which Tensor doesn't. So people have, I don't know, disagreements about different modeling in socionics. But again, to be clear, this is really what Western socionics is modally, and what I would do in my own modeling is flatten this cube into a line such that we're looking at quadras and not dimensionality. So I talk about quadras a lot. Let's talk a little bit about what quadras are. This might be review material for some people, maybe for other people it's not. So quadras are original to Auguste's formulations of socionics. They were first described in the Theory of Intertype Relations, published in 1982, or written in 1982, regardless of when or where it was published. And quadras, there are 4 quadras, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, and each quadra has 2 axes of complementary information elements. The information elements themselves are organized into several kinds of opposites. All the rational elements are grouped together, and all the irrational elements are grouped together. So these are things that probably people know. Fe and Ti are grouped together. They're a kind of opposite that is inherently complementary. And Fe and Fi are a kind of opposite that are inherently different types of the ethics dimension that are opposed to one another. And they're organized on opposite sides of these quadras. And the way that I interpret the different quadras is that these elements that go together have some things in common. Both Fe and Ti are clarity seeking, whereas Fi and Te seek source integrity or integrity seeking. These are some terms that Jack Aaron developed. I developed the term source integrity, but he changed it to integrity seeking. They kind of mean the same thing. Clarity seeking is a term that he invented, compared to the previous thing that I called it differently. The irrational elements are divided into Ni and Si are the world accepting elements, and Ni and Se are the world rejecting elements. And quadras exist at the intersections of these 2 axes and have 4 valued elements and 4 unvalued elements each. What is meant by clarity seeking, integrity seeking, world accepting, and world rejecting? This is the only wall of text that I have in this presentation, but I have some massive walls of text. These are walls of text that I came right through my book, and we don't have to look at them. I included these because I intend for this presentation to be somewhat informal, and it might be helpful if there are questions conceptually about themes to put on these walls of text and let people take notes while I talk about them. But I don't intend for everybody to copy or even really look at these walls of text. Just to say that we could talk about some conceptual things if people are interested in talking about some conceptual things. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Anything in the presentation so far, any of the modeling that you want to ask me about?
Well, I did want to bring up something that I brought up to you before around the whole dimensionality factor, right? And that has a lot to do with the simple fact that while dimensionality is covering strength and what else is strength and priority, the difference between how you're going about it and why you're categorically rejecting dimensionality as a concept is simply because the attribution to the strength and priority, it differs from what it's currently how it's currently designated. Correct? I just want to put that out there.
Yes, the way you said it is a little bit confusing, but that's also my fault because of the way that I did this diagram. Because there's some terminology here. If you look at at Tensor's writing, he calls dimensionality strength, and he calls quadras priority. And then what I have labeled in this diagram here as strength, he calls level. There are a couple of things about this modeling. And so, first of all, the mathematics here, P, D, and L are the variables in this very simple equation where the overall function strength, SE, is equal to the priority of SE being the strength of some element E. Say TE, this diagram here, which type is in this diagram? Can anyone see which type is in this diagram?
I'm not
For no
screen.
particular reason, I use the LSE type as my example type often. And this diagram is for the presence cube for the LSE, where at the top of the highest strength function is TE and the lowest strength function is NI, and these other functions are in the middle. So the strength of the element TE is equal to the priority of TE plus the dimensionality of TE, and because dimensionality is scaled in values from 1 to 4, priority is also scaled in values from 1 to 4, and the overall strength is going to be 4, so level 4. Or the strength of any is 4 priority but 2 dimensionality, so it's level 3. All of the elements in the presence cube with no coefficient scaling, the cube is just a cube, both sides are equally weighted, come out to these nice round numbers. So when I talk about dimensionality, this was what you asked and what we talked about the other day. Dimensionality is a specific term. Function strength, the concept of function strength is not the same as dimensionality. What I mean by function strength, and I'm going to call it strength because it's the best word for it, is to what extent people are which functions are most heavily attended, which are the most spontaneously attended, which elements people direct their attention to. This is a measure, in my view, of function strength. Again, Ibrahim will, if you look at strength in Ibrahim's diagram, he will associate strength with dimensional strength as compared to priority. So he has this view that functions have different strength and value. Some functions are strong but unvalued, which means, in his view, that they are easy for people to use but not very rewarding to use. And other functions have high value but low strength. So in his view, these are very rewarding to use, but people are not very good at them. This is a core feature of his model that I don't like, because it has multiple outputs to measure. So if you're going to measure somebody's use of any, instead of looking at how much they're attending to any, you have to look at how good they are at any and how rewarding it is for them to use any. And I think this is a weakness of his model, and I've told him this many times, which he's mostly ignores. Having more parameters, even in the case where these are output measurements, is less simple than a model where, first of all, it's epistemologically questionable whether or not these abstract concepts, information elements, have these different variables. I think there's better grounding to say that people pay attention to some of them more than others, they use some of them more than others. How do you really measure, how do you evaluate whether people are good at something that they don't find rewarding and don't want to use? Like the ignoring function, which has 1 priority and 3 dimensionality in Tensor's model. I think this is it's hard to know that. And so I think this is a significant weakness, and mathematically speaking, the model that I will talk about later does not have this distinction between strength and value. It has only one output, which is strength, and it gets to a lot of the same places as Tensor's presence cube, or the scaled presence cube, the rectangular prism one, without having this questionable feature about having a separate strength and level dimension. And we will talk about that when we get there.
Okay.
But yes, dimensionality is a specific term with a specific meaning. This is different than the concept of function strength. The concept of function, like some functions are stronger than others. I'm in agreement with that. Dimensionality, dimensional strength, that's not what dimensional strength means. When people are talking about dimensional strength, in 99% of cases, they are talking about your max dimensionality.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, I just wanted that clarified so that people
mhm.
understood that. I don't necessarily think that when we are discussing these things, they're going specifically off of that definition
I
of
think people,
dimensionality.
almost everyone that is talking about dimensionality is talking about your max dimensionality, and your max dimensionality is the thing that is part of Western socionics, part of the presence cube, and not part of the theory of quadras. My view of the presence cube is that the dimension should be flattened, and we should look at it only as a line.
Right.
And there's a little
Okay.
bit of nuance to that line, but I I think that the quadrus part of his cube is a good dimension, and the dimensionality part is not.
Gotcha. I don't know. I know speaking for myself, I've always looked at dimensionality as the strength and the kind of the like how much of a scope you have around it in terms of the ability, like where your attention gravitates to first, right? So there goes the prioritizing, and then understanding that there is a distance between these functions that's occurring as well. And so that whole attenuation and amplification is occurring. It's almost like pulling strings, right? So if you're pulling on this string heavily, then obviously this one is going to get shortened. And then that's where I start seeing like strength, distance, and so on and so forth. But okay, go on.
Yeah. One additional piece to this, you
Mhm,
mentioned that there's dimensionality is scope of different functions, and
mhm.
this when Yermak and Bukhalov described dimensionality in the mid '90s, this is what they said: is that dimensional functions of higher dimensional strength have more scope in more different situations. So the one-dimensional functions only have the scope of immediate lived experience. That's the only thing they can learn from. Whereas four-dimensional functions can learn from the experiences of others and can abstract about different experiences that they didn't have. That's your Mach's view. Um, when people talk about dimensional strength, they in 99% of cases are talking about the numbers that Yermak presented. So for the LSE, the four-dimensional functions are TE and SE. And the three-dimensional functions are SI and TI, and so on. Um, People who talk about dimensional strength in the community casually may or may not be talking about this different scope of functions, that the one-dimensional functions only have access to personal experience, and the two-dimensional functions also have access to the experiences of others, and so on. That part of the theory of Yermak's theory is somewhat more obscure and not part of the common parlance when Joe Schmo on Reddit talks about dimensionality, who has looked at a couple of Socionics articles, but not a lot. He's probably talking about the same functions as being high or low dimensional, but not necessarily about not necessarily with the same sophistication about what dimensional strength means.
Right. So does the scope conflict with how you're seeing strength, or what? Like how
Well,
does that work?
um, the the function strengths the function strengths are not in the right places. They're aquadral. Dimensionality is inherently aquadral, and I'll explain what that means. Um, well, one thing that it means is that in the presence cube, the quadra dimension is literally here on the cube, and the dimensionality dimension is something else. So the 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 way that Tensor made this cube is with the several model A dichotomies: strong, weak, valued, unvalued, and um, bold and cautious. The bold elements are heteroverted elements for a type, or sorry, homoverted elements for a type. In other words, the LSE is an extrovert. All of the extroverted functions are bold, and the cautious functions are all the introverted functions. I don't really think of it in the way of bold cautious. This dichotomy occupies no space in my thinking. But the LSE has a relationship towards all of the different elements in their quadra, and in particular, it's useful to model them as being good at TE and NE, which are the extroverted delta elements. These is a type-defining block for the LSE, and NE only has two-dimensionality in Yermak's modeling, whereas TI, an unvalued element, and SE, another unvalued element, have higher dimensionality. So the layout of elements in Yermak's dimensionality is a-quadral and basically inconsistent with quadral principles. If you're focusing on the themes that are part of the quadra and saying that these themes are important and more emphasized, it's not clear in what way dimensional attention or dimensional strength plays any useful role in that. Tensor in his presence cube says that it does play some useful role, but it's not part of quadras in some way, that there's a difference between value and strength, where you can have these weak functions that people are nonetheless not interested in, they don't value, but they're good at somehow. Again, this is all not part of my modeling. The question you asked about whether or not the scope itself is what I'm opposed to, it's all part of some very different modeling that doesn't make sense to me, I guess, is how I would say it. It's not really the scope, but I agree that the scope also doesn't make sense. It's more like I developed my own model, which we'll get to at the end later in the presentation, about what functions are strongest and how I think about which functions are strongest and how the attention is divided between them. And it's not the same as the scope of dimensionality.
Okay. I'll hold off on continuing to ask then. Go on.
Before we talk about that, I have this section on blocks. Blocks are a very convenient way about talking about quadras because blocks are subcategories of quadras. So what is a block? A block is a combination of one rational and one irrational element. So for example, TE plus SI. TE and SI is a block. When we talk about blocks, there are a couple of bits of terminology. One question is whether the block is one of the elements in the block more emphasized than the other. If it is, then the block is ordered. So there is a difference between TE and SI and TE. There's also a way of thinking about blocks where they're equal to each other. TE is equal to SI. There's no order in that block. There's a distinction between classical blocks and skew blocks. Classical blocks have elements that are different extrovertedness. TE and SI are different extrovertedness. This is a classical block. TE and NE is a skew block. And these are the two type defining blocks for the LSI. One of them is a classical block, the LSE I meant. One of them is a classical block and the other one is a skew block. This is interesting because blocks are subcategories of quadras. The way that I view socionics is that the different socionics types differently express their quadra themes. So when I say that T and SI and TE and NE are the type defining blocks for the LSE, what I mean is that this type expresses these blocks, and the reason why they are this type is because they express these blocks more emphatically than any of the other blocks in their quadras, or any of the other blocks that are not in the delta quadra. The theory of quadras is fundamentally about quadra themes, and it is worth noting that each block belongs to exactly one quadra. TESI is a delta block because both of those elements belong to the delta quadra. The gamma quadra also values TE, but it doesn't value SI, so it's not a delta block. And the alpha quadra values SI, but it doesn't value TE, so it's not an alpha block. It's a delta block only. So all of the delta types have this block, but they might have this block expressed in different ways. And the ways in the thematic content of these blocks and the ways in which they're more emphasized is the entirety of socionics, and this is the entirety of what I look at. Not the entirety. It's the vast majority of what I look at in typing work. When I'm doing typing work, this is fundamentally what I look at, is which themes are people expressing. These are the themes that I have come to in my own practice, my own modeling. I started to come up with these themes a long time ago. Perhaps about 17 years ago was when I first started to think about this in this way. And the first theme that I thought of, that I sort of understood, was harsh judgment. This pertains to my own typing of myself. I view myself as a gamma type. And I understood this about my experience. And when I was reading about socionics and read about the ESI type, as being a type that's cautious and skeptical of people. And I recognized some of these own features in the way that I was navigating the world, and came to this idea about harsh judgment. Judgment meaning that FI valuing types tend to focus on the character of others, and they block it with SE, which means that they tend to evaluate the character of others with a greater degree of immediacy than the delta quadra, which has good faith judgment. They're still focused on the character of others, but there's less immediacy. More of the judgment is focused on potential, the ways in which people could develop into the characters that people expect, which is a less harsh, less skeptical, less perhaps demanding way of thinking about other agents than the gamma quadra. So these are all of the different themes. The first one that I describe, just to give a taste, is harsh judgment. And I thought about going through these themes in greater depth, which is something that I would do in a more introductory course on socionics, which I've taught that kind of course. And I try to describe each of these themes for about 2 to 3 minutes, because they're all these are all fundamental to how the different types operate, and they translate, I think, better into type descriptions, where if you talk about different type descriptions, these themes will come up in the way that I'm talking about the different type descriptions. You might notice that the way in which I've described these is only for classical blocks. So I have a theme for the classical block for the LSE, the TE and SI, which is self-sufficiency. I don't really have names for the themes in skew blocks. This is because I've been thinking about how to frame quadra themes for the better part of 2 decades, and I had a lot of time to think about this. The concept of a skew block was invented later. I mean, these existed, but I didn't have names for this. And this is only something that has come up, and the modeling in this part here, the block modeling, has only been things that I've been thinking about for about 10 years, which is a long time perhaps, but I really haven't fleshed them out, perhaps also because I already have names and a lot of conceptual work for these 8 themes for the classical blocks. And Augusta was more interested in classical blocks. Not exactly in the same way. She didn't ascribe the same thematic content that I've fleshed out here, but she was interested in the ego block, the superego block, the id block, and the superid block in their different processing. And these are all classical blocks, although they're only some of the classical blocks. For instance, the LSE has T and SI as its ego block. What about TE and NI? That's also a classical block that just happens to be a vertical block in Model A for the LSE as opposed to a horizontal block. And for whatever reasons, Augusta was more interested in the horizontal blocks, which is a bunch of modeling of Augustas that I don't understand very well. However, in order to, when I was thinking about blocks, one thing that you can do is represent Model A in terms of all of the different blocks. So in other words, in terms of all of the different quadra themes, because blocks have a isomorphic relationship with the different themes that are expressed in different quadras, and each block corresponds to exactly one quadra. This is kind of not a new idea, but also kind of a new idea. It's an old idea because of function charges. Function charges originated. It's not exactly clear when function charges originated. The Socion in 1985 makes some mention of function charges, but it's not very clear that Augusta really meant anything by the charges she assigned. Then Gulienko did more work, and really the function charges were more formally introduced in Model B in 2004, I think, by Alexander Bukalov, and then Gulienko, who had been working on function charges before this, eventually made Model G, which also uses function charges. Model B and Model G use function charges different than one another. So for instance, in Model B, let me try and get this right. In Model B, the leading function for the ESE is FE minus, whereas in Model G, Gulienko changed it and made it FE plus. I think that that's right, but I might have gotten those mixed up because I don't use either of these models. But I'm pretty sure that I'm like 90% sure that I'm right. I should have checked this beforehand. But so the idea of function charges is to divide each function into two different types, two different subcategories. You have subtypes of the different information elements. TE plus and TE minus are both types of TE, but they have some different emphases. What they didn't think of is making these into blocks. So when I think of TE plus and TE minus, what I think of is gamma TE compared to delta TE. And one of these is TE flavored with the delta element, Si, and one of them is TE flavored with the gamma element, Ni. And this gives blocks are inherently quadral. They're a quadral idea because one block corresponds to one quadra. TE plus and TE minus are like, well, is the TE more expansive, or is it more based on conserving resources, or is it more based on acquiring new resources, or something like that? And this is not a quadral. This concept is not about quadras. It's a different type of distinction, but it is a model that makes 16 elements in a similar way that the block models, where I have delta TE and gamma TE, is also a model of 16 elements. We talked earlier about classical blocks and skew blocks, and about whether blocks are ordered or not. Should they be ordered or not in making a 16-element model? You can make either choice, as it turns out. You can have blocks that are ordered, or you can have blocks that include skew blocks in the model. And I invented these 5 different block models in a 2022 blog post where I described them and gave them these names. And they differ based on whether or not you make the order equivalency and the skew equivalency. It turns out that there's a contradiction that arises if you try to make both equivalencies. So in order to resolve that, there are 5 models instead of 4. And what this just means is whether or not in this particular model, the blocks that consist of the functions are ordered blocks, and whether or not they have classical blocks or classical blocks and skew blocks, whether or not these things are different. So Model A8 and Model A8 skew uh, are models where the the quadrathemes are, these models are unordered, and they do not make the skew equivalency because it would actually cause a contradiction and break the model. Um, and these kinds of models are both of these models have as elements unordered quadrathemes. So, for instance, in the LSE, the function 1 equals 2 is equal to the function te equals si, and so on for the other. So function 1 equals 4 is the function te equals ni, because ni is the fourth function in Model A, si is the second function in Model A, te is the first function in Model A. And this is a convenient way of doing the terminology in Model A. So elements in all the block models are named in this way. And when Ibrahim Tensor and I semi-simultaneously approached this same type of modeling, we didn't have names for any of this stuff. Yevgeny Shipchenko was doing this kind of work in the 90s, and he gave the different blocks, like 1 plus 4, some other random name. And he also didn't actually conceptualize it in terms of quadras, and he didn't really elaborate very much on the blocks. He just named them all. When Ibrahim Tensor and I started talking about this, because we both know the numbers 1 through 8 and what functions they correspond to in Model A by heart, we used a simpler terminology like 1 plus 2, 1 plus 6, in order to refer to these functions in the 16-element models. And this is a much simpler and more logical way of naming them than anything that Shipchenko made his own set of completely new terms, which you would then have to learn. Model A16 is the most important of the block models because in Model A16, to define Model A16 again, the Model A16 has ordered blocks. There is no order equivalency, but it does not have skew blocks. In other words, both of the delta TE blocks are equivalent to each other. TE TE plus SI, which is 1 plus 2 in the LSE, is literally considered the same thing as TE plus NE, which is 1 plus 6. They are both simply delta TE. So this is the only model of the 16-element models that has as its different elements, the 16 different elements, are the 8 different information elements with each of their quadra flavors: delta TE and delta TE and gamma TE, delta SI and alpha SI, and so on for all of the different 16-element models. Ibrahim Tensor, in his own work, has a model that is the same as this. Structurally, it is exactly Model A16. He calls it Model A2. I'm going to call it Model A16 because I think it makes more sense. It's a 16-element model. 16 is in the name. The other models seem somewhat less useful to me. They are both ways of representing blocks in Model A, in terms translating Model A into blocks as opposed to individual functions. And the types of functions that they have different levels of order and skew equivalency. In Model A32, which is a 32-element model rather than a 16-element model, every possible block is included. And this is probably too many things to think about. So when it's certainly in Model A32, it's hard to reason about. Maybe you can reason usefully about 1 plus 6 and 1 plus 2 as being different emphases. T plus SI and T plus NE are emphasized in the LSE type. These are the blocks that define this type, and these are the three functions that this type is good at. What about block 5 plus 4 compared to 5 plus 8? How do we assess the strength of those two blocks compared to one another? That seems like a very hard question. That's not something that has been elaborated. And one of my purposes in presenting this model is to more accurately talk about what I do during typing work, because these are the things that I look at. I look at the actual themes, and you can model them using these block models because the blocks are equivalent to themes. But mostly when I do that, the themes that I'm looking at are these ones from model A16. And I'm more ready to this is all somewhat work in progress modeling, but I'm more ready to make some claims about what's going on in model A16 than I am with these models, where I've done much less conceptual legwork, other than really defining that these models mathematically exist, because you could make different choices with the order and skew equivalencies. But I don't use these practically in typing. Whereas you can make some claims, and these are somewhat contested claims because Ibrahim is working on this, and we have not agreed about everything in terms of how strong we should expect these functions to be. So, for instance, in the LSE, 6 plus 5 is a strong function. This is any plus fi, where any is the stronger function. So this is delta any compared to alpha any. How strong should alpha any be in the LSE? Well, less strong than delta any. The LSE should emphasize delta any more than alpha any, but how much more? How much more is something that Ibrahim and I have not necessarily agreed upon, and maybe don't even see as being consistent across all the different types. My view is that it probably is kind of consistent across the different types, but I'm open to collecting more data about it. By the way, in the function charge modeling, both Model B and Model G don't have all 16 functions. They usually there's a confusing thing about Model B, which is not elaborated, but maybe the 16 functions are included in Model B, but it's not really elaborated by Bukhalov. The 16 different functions here are, so in Model B and Model G, the LSE has TE minus, I think is correct, as is there in both Model G and Model B, and SI plus. These are the delta ST valued elements. The version of the mobilizing function that they have is actually the 6 plus 7 version and not the 6 plus 5. In other words, the LSE has as its mobilizing function the leading function of the ILE, the alpha NE, instead of the delta NE. These are not considered alpha and delta in the function charge model, but you can look at which one the IE has and which one the ILE has. The IE has NE minus, so that's the one that the LSE should emphasize more, but in Model B and G it's not. They both have the opposite feature, which I think is a fatal flaw of both of those models if they weren't already fatally flawed. That was probably pretty technical. Does anyone have any questions? Anything that wasn't clear that you want to ask about?
Kind of curious when you mentioned the plus and minus functions. Is it okay if we can elaborate the differences between that? And to make it simple, specifically the T and SI in what you have yapped about.
So both Model B and Model G are 16 element functions, or 16 element models. They have the 8 different IM elements, and they have plus and minus versions of each of them. However, these are thought of as having a positive flavor and a negative flavor. that don't really correspond very cleanly to quadra themes. The way that I think about 16-element models is not in terms of TE plus and TE minus. I thought of the difference between gamma TE and delta TE, and it's easy to model those things as TE plus NI on the one hand, and TE that is flavored with NI compared to TE that is flavored with SI. That is the 16-element model that I'm using in contrast to the function charge models. The function charge models are semantically kind of questionable. In some cases, and they all were invented and fit into this idea of having a positive variant and a negative variant. So some of them are much cleaner and easier to understand in this respect than others. For example, with Fi plus and Fi minus is more skeptical about the character of other people, and Fi plus is more welcoming, more about relationship building compared to Fi minus, which is more about relationship protecting the self by keeping it away from bad relationships. That kind of seems similar to the difference between harsh judgment and good faith judgment, where Fi and Se evaluates relationships, evaluates the character of other people more immediately. Fi and Ne evaluates the character of people more non-committally, more for their potential. That's not such a bad analogy for one another. What about some other functions, however? What about the difference between Ne plus and Ne minus? Semantically speaking, that's a lot harder for me to understand. To be honest, I don't really remember what all of the semantic descriptions are for the different functions. I did mention earlier that Fe plus and differs as to which quadra expresses it between model G and model B, and that's something that I don't think really makes sense. It would make sense to see Fe plus as being the positive emotionality of the alpha quadra, and for Fe minus to be the passion energizability of the beta quadra, which is true in model G but not in model B, unless I got it backwards. But I'm as I said before, I think I'm 90% sure that that's right. So I think that this is thinking about these in terms of function charges is pretty semantically difficult for most of these functions. It's much easier for me to understand, okay, the difference between alpha Ne and delta Ne is that one of these is structural exploration and the other one is character exploration, good faith judgment, as compared to Ne plus or Ne minus, where I'm a little bit lost. So Ne plus explores more possibility, and Ne minus, I don't know, refines more possibilities. But that's related to how I see Ne and Ni. So I'm not actually sure what the semantic meaning is for some of these. They're hard to justify.
All right then. Before I shut my mouth, from what I remembered, I have read a little bit of Ne plus and minus and whatever, and I believe the difference is that Ne plus is more entertained about, let's say, more out of the realms type of ideas, or pretty much like any ideas that they believe haven't been really discovered, and tend to be quite easily distracted when superficial, what they define as superficial, while minus or whatever was more so refining phenomenon or ideas that have already been established, such as let's say, for example, like conspiracy theory or something around that, and whatever the fuck not. Is it correct or is it false?
Yeah, in my opinion, the semantic description there has some overlap with the difference between any and ni, where any is a more exploratory function that focuses on expansive possibilities, and ni is a more refining function that focuses on limiting possibilities. So when you say that any is more refining, I have a bit of a question about how any is more refining, whether or not that means it's actually veering into ni. So again, I find this somewhat difficult to justify. It seems like there shouldn't be a difference in the degree of explorationness when it's flavored with different, depending on whether it's flavored in the alpha or the delta way. There's more of a difference in content or in focus, in what kinds of things the exploration is focused on, whether on ideological structural logic or on character of people. That's my modeling, and I think that seems simpler to me.
I see. I then continue you.
Mm-hmm. All right. The last model that I want to talk about in this lecture is something I'll call the axial model, which is something that I developed. This has been in my head for a long time, but I only formalized it somewhat more recently in response to the presence cube. What the axial model is I organize in my head the different axes of functions. When I say an axis of functions, what I mean in this case is TE and TI form an axis. They're both types of logic, and they're kind of opposite sides of the same coin. They have very different emphases on how they focus on logic. My definitions for these in TE is defined as focusing on the accuracy of propositional factual information, whereas TI focuses on the structure of propositional factual information. And it tends to be the case, this is just an observed thing, that in socionics, people who focus a lot on one of them suppress the other. This is kind of the way that I've always thought about this. This is just something that I've observed. So my view is that people who are very strong in the leading function are not focused on the ignoring function at all. Instead, when they focus on logical information, they prefer pervasively to use the leading function. And the same kind of thing is true of the mobilizing function, but maybe just a little bit more weakly. The leading function is, in all models, defined as the thing that people pay attention to most spontaneously. The mobilizing function, I think, seems very similar to the leading function, but maybe people focus on it just a little bit less spontaneously, have a little bit more distractible attention towards it. And the axis is very unbalanced, but a little bit less dramatic in terms of the degree to which the leading function always wins and suppresses the ignoring function. The other two axes are unbalanced in the sense that they're kind of flipped on their sides. Both of the functions are contributing to some degree, and the creative axis is much stronger than the other unbalanced axis, the suggestive axis, where the creative and demonstrative function are both strong-ish functions, but the creative function is a stronger function than the demonstrative. But the overall strength of this axis is high, whereas the suggestive function and the role function are both somewhat weak functions. So this is this rather crude diagram that I created. This is the only diagram that isn't part of at least not yet, part of a book that I'm writing soon. All of the other diagrams in this presentation are things that were directly from that I already had because I made them for my book. And I'll probably try to incorporate something like this diagram, but I made this kind of off the cuff recently. So you guys are a little bit my test subjects for putting ideas to and receiving some feedback from about things that I might want to include in my book and changes that I could make to some of these diagrams if these diagrams are not very clear. And there's a little bit of a visual representation here in this model where the functions that are higher up are the stronger ones. So mathematically speaking, I came up with the very simple math to describe the overall function strength. Again, SE, the strength of an element E, is the axial strength times the axial balance. Both functions on an axis have the same strength. The leading function and ignoring function are on the same axis. They have the same strength. They have a balance that adds up to 1. So the axial balance of the leading function 0.99 and the axial balance of the ignoring function 0.01 add up to 1. So the functions may be variously balanced, and then when you multiply these out, you come up with some function strengths. That is what I'm modeling as the overall function strengths. Very simple math. One feature that I think is very nice about this model is that it is easier to model the idea that I have about the superid, which is that the superid is the developmental block of the superid is the developmental functions that when people work on and get better at their weaknesses, they generally get better at the superid. This is a controversial statement. This is maybe somewhat of a hot take, but I'm not the only person to have this idea. Western socionics, kind of more than half of Western socionics has the idea that the superid is the main block of development. Jack Aaron, for example, has talked about this in some of his work. And my view is that the superid are the blocks that are leveled up as over time as people work on their weaknesses. The mobilizing function is leveled up rather easily during adolescence. The suggestive function is leveled up with greater difficulty or perhaps never when people are adults. These ages are approximate. Some adults are children and some children are adults. So the exact trajectory is something that depends on the circumstances. But nonetheless, increasing the parameters of the axes themselves for the weaker axes is something that my model allows for in terms of modeling the development. And this is a very debatable topic as to whether or not the changes that I show, where the suggestive function gets stronger, the mobilizing function gets stronger, but in some cases is much lower in cases of low development where people haven't worked on it very much. These are the kinds of things that I interpret that I'm seeing in, for instance, typing work, in casework. I see mostly cases where people are very good at the mobilizing function, but occasional exceptions to that. And I see some cases where people are much better at the suggestive function than I expect, but also that doesn't happen very often. So those are things that I observe in practice, and these are subject to interpretation because typing work is hard and reading is hard, and there are multiple different ways to interpret things. But that feature that the developmental function, the superid are the developmental functions in Model A, is not only my idea, although it is part of my modeling, and the axial model does a better job with that than other modeling. I want to compare here just the way that the axial model works in the theory of quadras to the presence cube and the presence rectangular prism. The presence rectangular prism looks a lot better than the presence cube, where for instance, ignoring function is very strong in the presence cube, whereas it's significantly weaker in the presence rectangular prism, where quadras are more emphasized than dimensional strength. And again, I emphasize that the presence rectangular prism is really what Western socionics usually is. Usually people are talking, when they're talking about Western socionics, they're usually using something like the presence rectangular prism, even if they don't call it the presence rectangular prism. That being said, I still look at this chart of the different math that I gave for my model and the math that I gave for the presence cube, and I see that there's some issues with the presence rectangular prism. Over the strength of the demonstrative function, for instance, in the presence rectangular prism seems very high to me. I think Ibrahim Tensor would disagree with that and say that this demonstrative function should be stronger. But I don't usually think of the demonstrative function. The demonstrative function, by the way, in classical socionics, the stuff that I looked at in the mid-2000s was not very much written about. It wasn't really very emphasized. I think it's a slightly more recent development that people focus a lot on the demonstrative function, focus a lot on dimensionality. Both the demonstrative function and the ignoring function, the id block in general was not very well elaborated by Augusta and not very widely discussed in that time. And the concept of dimensionality was not very widely discussed in that time compared to the way it is now. So the differences between the axial model and the theory of quadras and the presence cube, the numbers are different. I think the demonstrative function is too high. The axial function has a model that it makes it easier to shift around the weak axis parameters to model the development of the super id. The presence cube, as we talked about before, has more parameters to measure, more measurements to make with this difference between value and strength distinction. This is not part of the axial model at all. I think that it's a simpler world that we live in where we only have one measurement of strength, whether or not people are paying attention to an element. Was it a high degree of attention or is it a low degree of attention? And I think that this is ontologically much better, much more well-grounded than the idea that there is a separate level of whether a function is rewarding, whether it's valued, and whether it is actually something people are good at. And it's a hard thing to measure because people don't use the things that are not rewarding that they're good at. How do we know that they're actually good at them if they never choose to use them? I, in my own somewhat introspective way of thinking, don't really think that I am good at the id block functions that I don't really care about. Maybe other people have different introspections, but I don't see people using these functions in my typing work, and I don't see what is to be gained from thinking about them as skillful functions. Does anybody have any questions? Any of these three models, the presence cube, the axial model, or any block models, those are the models that I'm most think that this presentation is about, but I'm happy to talk about any kind of comparative modeling in socionics, any questions that people may have.
I'm not sure if you answered it, but Ethics did have a question in side chat about a demonstrative function being as strong as the leading function.
That's part of dimensionality. That's an idea of dimensional strength. In my model, in the Western socionics modeling that we have here, that is on this screen, the demonstrative function is definitely not as strong as the leading function. In dimensionality, it is. Again, blah. This is what you were talking about when you asked me about when you say dimensionality, how specific are you being? And I'm talking about your max dimensionality. My view is that your max dimensionality is wrong. It doesn't exist. And that's a hot take. That's a controversial statement that people don't agree with, including in the rest of Western socionics, where the presence cube has a component of dimensionality and a component of quadras. And again, some people joined later and didn't hear the things that I had to say about it. My view is that the presence cube is not a very good model. When you turn it into the presence rectangular prism, it turns into a much better model. But the dimensional component, these orthogonal contributions of quadra values, as represented by priority and of dimensional strength, are that the correct contribution of quadras is 100% and the correct contribution of dimensionality is 0. It should be flattened. However, if you use this rectangular prism that mostly focuses on the priority and has just a little bit of dimensionality, you get pretty good results because you only focus very little on dimensionality. That's my view in my modeling. Does that clarify? Do you have any other questions about that? Any of my hot takes that you want to argue with? This is a good time for that.
How do you denote strength for the elements for the functions?
What do you mean? How do I denote it?
How do you qualify the strength of the elements? Like what makes the base stronger mathematically than the creative? Like where do you get strength from?
Well, here's the math that I have in the axial strength model. I have made up these numbers in such a way as to follow this equation, where each axis has a strength and each axis has a balance towards one end or the other. And if you multiply these together, you get the overall function strength.
So that's true for all of the functions that you have, like for a given type.
Yes. I'm
Gotcha.
not trying to say that these instantiations of these parameters, the axial strength and axial balance, are all always the same all the time. In fact, I suggested that as development continues, you can make these modifications to these parameters. Change the A and B parameters for the inferior axis and the suggestive axis. The inferior axis being the one with the mobilizing and vulnerable functions, both of the weak axes, and you get these slightly different results. Mainly the slightly different results are in the suggestive function, mobilizing function, but it's not the only difference. For instance, you see the roll function has this, 0.28 or 0.27 or 0.24, very similar numbers depending on the different parameterization. But the numbers that I have here are arbitrary instantiations that I made up because this math is informed by the modeling that I was thinking of in my head. And I made these numbers up to tune as best I could how I thought the functions usually look. But sometimes we see the mobilizing function being a lot weaker than I expect, than it is usually. And sometimes you see the suggestive function being a lot stronger. The suggestive function being a lot stronger, I think, is a less controversial position. That sometimes people are very good at their weaknesses and they're very well balanced and have more command of the suggestive function. But I think of both of these as part of my modeling, and so in typing work, I keep these possibilities in mind, even if modally the function strengths look more like this, more like in the typical row. I try to keep in mind that the low development or high development patterns also are possible. And this is a level of variation that is somewhat theoretically informed, but also could be attacked as being you can justify anything with this modeling, which I don't think I try to do, but it's a
That's kind of what I was getting down to, is like, well, if the normal socionics, this is kind of a vague statement, but people that use dimensionality, which is most people in Model A, if that's not sufficient, if that doesn't actually explain the role of the demonstrative, how strong it is, how you use it, and my natural question was, well, then how are you deriving these parameters that even create the axes to begin with? Because that would be a golden question. Because at least with the demonstrative, you can actually use basic math to arrive at why it would be four-dimensional. right? And it's a pretty simple explanation. At least in my opinion. I mean, it's your demonstrative is your strongest judging element, and it's the same attitude as your base. So just based off of deduction from that, it would follow that that would be equal in strength because it's your opposite. It's a judging function that you're the strongest at because it's extroverted or introverted. That seems to make sense. So I was just curious about how you even derive the parameters, and you basically said that it's arbitrary.
It is arbitrary. I derived the parameters in a way that is to match the results that I saw in practice. And you're not the only person to complain about, well, where did these numbers come from? How do you decide that the creative function the balance between the creative function and the demonstrative function is 70% towards the creative? Those are I made these numbers up to match as closely as I could estimate what I see in practice, which is a subjective question which depends on how you do your reading. The demonstrative function, by the way, it doesn't change in if you look at the typical function outcomes, the low outcomes, the high outcomes, in all of these cases the demonstrative function has a strength of 0.3. So I don't view the demonstrative function as being very strong in any of these circumstances, nor is it that strong in, well, it's stronger in the presence cube variation that has the presence cube has a contribution of dimensionality that leads the demonstrative function to be more strong. And I agree that the presence cube is more widely what people are following when they follow Western socionics. And that's part of what I'm doing in this presentation, is to clarify the differences in modeling.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fair question to ask that, because in any system, if there's arbitrarity, then there's going to be a weak justification that follows that.
I think that you get to this problem no matter how you do the math. Your suggestion that you gave us an explanation that I don't think was much of an explanation about why the demonstrative function is strong. In my view, the mobilizing function is basically always stronger than the demonstrative function. Why should the demonstrative function be strong? Simply because it has the same attitude as the base function. So does the mobilizing function. The mobilizing function is part of the same quadra.
Right. Well, because of the mobilizing, let's say for an SLE, they're weak at ethics. That's a really easy solution. Because they're stronger at logic, and it's in the attitude that they're native in, why wouldn't it follow that would be equally as strong? Why wouldn't it at the very least follow that would be stronger than the mobilizing?
I don't have the same set of concepts. The way that I think about this is that the SLE is strong at ethics, or the SLE is strong at logic and weak at. So when you say this, I think of these as being of different strengths. The axes are all of different strengths, and the SLE is weaker at ethics than they are at logic. Right. However, the dimension, like they so strongly favor using the mobilizing function over the vulnerable function. The vulnerable function is very suppressed, that the mobilizing function ends up being quite strong. And they don't end up being they don't end up being very weak at FE. I don't think that this is the correct way of thinking about it. And this is true for all of the Jungian dichotomies, right? The SLE has strong SE, but they don't really have strong SI. They don't really focus on this. They have strong FE, but they have weak FI, but they have strong FE. I don't think that it's useful. This is a hot take. I don't use the strong and weak dichotomies. I don't use the Jungian dichotomies hardly at all, because they're not part of the quadra. They're not part of the quadra organization, where.
Okay, so you're saying that you derive strength from the axes, not the actual elements or functions. Is that correct? Because you just said
Yes.
that SLEs. Okay. Okay. So I mean, I'm also driving. I could probably look at your chart in order to give a better, engagement. But that's what I was confused on, because I would have no problem agreeing that the mobilizing is stronger than the polar. It's like, obviously, but it's not strong. I don't see how it would follow that it would be stronger than the demonstrative, because for an SLE, logic is supreme. So, but if you're
Various
using an
we're
act,
talking about some sort of side conversations about some modeling that you have some different stuff that you looked at, but here's the fundamental answer to that question. I think the reason that the mobilizing function is stronger is because the mobilizing function is part of the valued blocks for that quadra, and the demonstrative function is not.
but it doesn't follow necessarily that because it's valued as stronger, or you're just
Well, in
operating under
my
that
view,
basic.
in my view, I'm ignoring there in the presence cube. Again, you may or may not have heard all of the things I said about this. There's orthogonal components of dimensional strength and value. I want to eliminate the dimensional axis of this and only focus on the value, and then use this to talk about function strength. And function strength
Sure.
is different than dimensional strength. I mean overall strength, and I'm going to call it strength because it's the best word for it. I could call it something else, like Ibrahim Tensor in his initial formulation called it level, but kind of abandoned that terminology because nobody really uses it. My
Yeah.
view is that socionics is a theory of quadras, and dimensionality is an aquadral concept. This is true, and this shouldn't be controversial. That is an objective feature of dimensionality. The SE is a high dimensional function, but it is an unvalued function. It is aquadral. The ignoring function is a three-dimensional function, but it's an unvalued function. This is an aquadral concept, and it doesn't align with the idea that the SLE is made up by emphasizing the SE and TI block and the SE and FE block. It's made up by those functions because those are the valued blocks, and those are strong blocks. Those are strong functions in that type. And this is also something that is, this is a kind of hard thing to explain in a short form because it requires a lot of casework. But my casework would be a bit confused without seeing the mobilizing function as a strong function. This is something that, in my view, people use all the time. And
So, right. No,
another,
I kind of get what you're putting down. I mean, I'm like gradually grasping your system, but so you don't even really have intertype relations in, right? I mean, it would follow that you wouldn't, from what you just said.
it has intertype relations. My view of intertype relations is Augusta was very specific about intertype relations. She thought duality was particularly good, and she said some very specific things about, for instance, benefit. Benefit is asymmetric. One partner benefits the other, and she had the specific things about mirage. Types are confused by each other. I think that all of the specific things that Augusta said are too strong. Actually, I think they're trivially wrong. It doesn't take very much poking in order to, you don't have to add very much things to the system to find disconfirming evidence to say that, duality doesn't actually always good, and benefit isn't always one directional, as she said. But I think that quadra values are a fundamental aspect of what she was thinking about in intertype relations, and that a soft version of intertype relations is a more interesting hypothesis, where people who have similar quadra values are have a higher probabilistic likelihood of being interpersonally compatible. It's a good starting point. It's not everything, and probably not even anywhere near the most important factor, but it's an interesting starting point to examine. That's what I think of intertype relations, is that a softer hypothesis is much more viable. Whereas Augusta's hard version of intertype relations is kind of trivially not very interesting.
So I'll ask one more question and then I'll stop because I don't want to hijack all this. But
No, it's a good time to ask
let's say you
questions.
have an
Go ahead.
ILE. Yeah, I just got off work too, so I'm cooking. I haven't talked all day. Um, so if you have an ILE that's in between LSC and EIE, how do you account for their how do I phrase this question? Obviously, there's aspects of an ILE that are shared with LSE, and there's aspects to an EIE that's shared with an ILE. That's what makes the, in some sense, mathematically, that's what puts the type in between two other adjacent types because they have some functional similarities. How would you even account for that in your system? Like, I know that you say that you want to base everything off of quadras, and that's why the unvalued elements don't really have a place, or in some sense. But you can see how an ILE is similar to an LSC because of the extroverted logic, right? So I don't know
Because
how
of the
you would.
extroverted logic. That confuses me. I'm
Yeah,
not sure if when you seem to want to talk about the benefit types. I'm not sure why you talk about the benefit types instead of comparing the ILE. The ILE could also sit between the IE and SLE types just as well. In my view,
yeah,
both of these types, the ILE is an adjacent quadrant of both of these types. They
right.
share part of their they share part of the motivation, and I think that extends to
The
the
motivation.
blocks that they have half of the axes in both cases. They have, in common with the beta quadra, they have the Fe and Ti axis. In common with the delta quadra, they have the Si and Ne axis. In both cases, I would say that the themes of, like, the beta quadra themes, where is that slide? The beta quadra themes of passion, energizability, and ideological conflict are things that alpha types, an ILE, has part of. They don't express those themes as strongly as their own quadras themes, but they kind of partially understand those themes and maybe partially express them. It's like Model A, where they sort of partially, in my view, the role function and the demonstrative function are sort of partially valued functions, partially expressed. In the same way, in Model A16, the ILE strongly expresses Ne plus Ti. They strongly express Ne plus Fe. Those blocks are strongly expressed. They partially express Fe and Ni. It's not the strongest expression, but it's kind of a block that they sort of partially have access to that theme, but not so much, and it's not so emphasized. They partially express Te and Si. They partially express Ne and Fi. They really don't express the gamma blocks
Right.
at all. That's my view about how to model that. I don't have any expectation to see the ILE as more like the benefit types that it's adjacent to as compared to the same temperament types that it's adjacent to. Other people
Yeah.
think about that more than I do, and I don't really understand that modeling.
Yeah.
They use
People
different
definitely
ideas. You mentioned that the ILE has, is similar to the LSE because they have TE. That does not strike me as a similarity between them. The LSE has a very strong TE, and the ILE has kind of middling to below average TE. That's not very similar in my view.
So you see ILEs having below average TE and like in real life?
Sure. I don't know, middling. It's kind of middling. It's sort of partially. My view of both the role function and the demonstrative function is they're sort of partially there, but they're middling functions.
How do they gain? Okay, so in order for them to structure ideas, wouldn't that require that they have a vessel of relevant information to constantly fuel that kind of ego block? Where would they be getting that? They would just be getting that information from NE. They wouldn't be gathering it from something else.
I'm not sure I understand your question very well. I think that this is a in any type that has TI, that focuses more on TI than TE is focusing more on the structure of their information than on verifying it, than on accumulating more of it. And these are in cases of like TI dominance that don't have any TE, that don't use any TE in my modeling. They have all of the TI valuing introverts that have high amounts of TI and low amounts of TE run the risk, shall we say, of not collecting confirmatory evidence. They collect small amounts of evidence and then build modeling to fit around it, whether or not that modeling is well supported by additional evidence. They tend to make generalizations about what fits together with the things in their field of view without considering a lot more evidence. Maybe you agree or disagree with that particular observation. ILEs that have creative TI and demonstrative TE, both of those are kind of contributing. TI is more influential in the way that ILEs think and the way that SLEs think, in my view. But they use TE as well. They're less likely than TI valuing introverts to be totally dismissive of accumulating more evidence in the way that sort of TI valuing introverts do sometimes do that and do fit their models to highly generalized data sometimes without considering more information. I think that ILEs tend to think this way somewhat. Jack, I think we both agree, is an example of an ILE, and I would say that Jack focuses more on. You can disagree and say he's some other type if you want, but
no,
the way
I think he's out.
The way I would interpret what Jack does is, he is not opposed to receiving more information about things. He accumulates more information, but he also structures his views in a way where he tries to make things fit together logically, and that's sort of more primarily what he focuses on doing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think there's just a difference in emphasis between your view and my view in regards to how much he actually acquires, because I do think that, I mean, for myself, I acquire a lot of information all the time. And so in order to structure it, it presupposes that you have sufficient incoming information to actually.
This is a tension. Whether or not you can structure information, whether you have enough information to do it, this is an inherent tension between TI and TE, no matter what side of how balanced the axis is between them. Again, I am openly saying here that I think TE is a middling function. The demonstrative function is a middling function. So TE in the ILE is a middling function. It's not unexpected for them to have some focus on it, but it's not as high as the focus on TI. I don't know.
No, I don't.
Maybe we have different
either.
expectations about what we would expect that to look like. But I think that, some degree on collecting more information is not unexpected, but it's not the primary focus. As compared, for instance, Blah, we agree, I think, as to see her as a TE type, and Blah does a lot of information collecting. Perhaps we don't agree about what TE type Blah is, but Blah does a lot of information collecting on a lot of different subjects by comparison, much more so than Jack.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, much more than Jack. How would you even know that? I was with you.
I mean, I've spent some time talking to Blah, and I've spent a lot of time talking to Jack.
And you think that Blah takes in more information than Jack does?
I don't think it's close. I think Blah looks at a lot more information, collects a lot more of that information without trying to sort it as much.
Hmm. Yeah, that one I'm gonna
She's
have to
very
strongly disagree with.
interested.
But
She's very interested in in different domains, different fields.
yeah,
Um,
have you had a conversation about politics, religion, philosophy, psychology? What I mean, Jack is constantly acquiring information about fields that he's not even really talking about in on videos.
I
I,
have
that
had
that
many conversations with Jack about many different things, not for almost 10 years, but yes, I know Jack quite well.
right,
I'm
and you
comfortable with the distinction I made between Blah and Jack. Very comfortable. Happy
yeah,
to
that's
disagree
crazy.
about that.
Yeah, that's fine. I know both of them very well too, so I can't. But okay, I digress.
Does does anyone have any other questions? This is a good time for question and answer period. I don't mind this because it's a good time. This is sort of the time that I set out of this presentation to take questions. I did make this one other slide talking. This is the most discussion about non-Western socionics that I have, which is about Augustus Socionics. Um, this is an interesting feature of Augustus Socionics, is that Augusta is very clear in her writing to describe the vulnerable function as a source spot. And my view is that the vulnerable function is not a source spot, it's a blind spot. And the suggestive function is the real source spot. This is the clearest, most relevant difference between. This is also generally the way that it's seen in Western modeling, definitely the way I see it. I kind of invented this idea. I invented the terms that I talk about, where Augustus sees the vulnerable function as a blind spot, or sorry, as a source spot, and I see it as a blind spot. I think that other Western authors see it in a similar way. I think Jack Aaron and Ibrahim Tensor, for example, also see it as a blind spot and see the suggestive as more of a source spot. This is, I think, the main difference between Augusta's modeling and Western socionics directly in Model A. The super-id development is not part of anything that Augusta talked about, but I think it's kind of an expansion pack, consistent with what Augusta said, just not an idea she thought of. The ego block is not changed between Augusta's Model A and Western socionics. The role function is not changed. They're described the same way. The id block has very low emphasis in Augusta's writing. She wrote about it very little at all, so I don't think this has changed either. It has low emphasis on Western socionics. It has low emphasis in Augusta's writing. I don't see these as different. The thing about between Augusta's Model A and Western socionics Model A that I see as very different is the vulnerable function. So that's a little piece of modeling that I also wrote about. That's all I have in terms of the modeling. Again, I'll take any questions if anyone has questions about any topic here.
I am slightly curious.
Mm-hmm.
It is the same concept that you kind of like discussed upon. It is more or so upon the demonstrative function, of course, and just want to see if I can get some questions answered. For example, when you say that let's say in any type that the demonstrative function is quite below average, I would have agreed that it's not as visible as how much it's empathized in, let's say, websites such as Wikisocial. But I wouldn't really, let's say, my own opinion, call it something that you will really see in an individual or something around that. Because, I find it quite, let's say, or at least from what I know, quite visible that somebody is using the demonstrative function quite often in a conversation. Sometimes you can even dominate certain conversations, even or something around that.
Did you have a more specific question?
How specific do you want me to get? Like, give you
Ask
some
us.
input.
You didn't really ask a question. I'm just. Do you have a question?
Let's say that, like, what I'm trying to elaborate is, let's say, like, how visible do you think that the demonstrative function is on another individual? Like, can you answer me that?
I think it's kind of middling. It's a middling function. It's a little visible. It's something that contributes. The way that I think of this axis, the creative axis between the creative and the demonstrative, is that the creative function is stronger. The creative function is always more visible, but the demonstrative function is somewhat visible as well. It's kind of middling.
Can you give me an example upon how middling it can look? Can you give me like a scenario on some sorts? Like, let's say that you are talking to, let's say you're talking to an SCI or something like that, and the demonstrative function should be extroverted sensing. No, wait, ESE
Sorry,
should
what?
be extroverted sensing. Yes. What did you say?
This is a somewhat vague kind of question, which the best way of answering it is by referring to type, like to examples, to examples of cases and typing work. DJ and I were arguing just a moment ago about Jack and his demonstrative function. We seem to have some disagreements about how to see Jack, which is fine. We clarified what our disagreement was about the possibly the modeling, but he had a specific disagreement about the features of Jack and his demonstrative function. Speaking about in hypothetical about any particular type and their examples, you mentioned that the SCI, FI demonstrative types. FI demonstrative types are more measured than FI ignoring types that are FE based types in their levels. One of the things that I see sometimes, and maybe this is not exactly what you asked, but this is what comes to mind for me in answering your question, is FE leading types will sometimes say or express that they don't recognize who they are inside themselves because they inhabit dynamically changing emotions. They change themselves and the masks they're wearing in response to situations around them habitually. Compared to this, FE creative types that also participate in wearing masks in certain situations often have more of a grounding towards who they are and often focus more on, they're more subdued, they focus more on character than FE leading types, yet these types are often more they're often kind of non-stationary in terms of the way that they see their role with others around them. They wear a lot of masks anyway. They don't try to communicate to other people at all times with a subdued authenticity that is the main communication style of FI dominant types. So in that sense, they're sort of middling. They're somewhere in between the FI dominant types that have the FI dominant types that communicate in a very subdued way. They're not like the FE dominant types that have little sense of themselves, don't focus on character, focus on expressing different things that come to their experience most of the time. They're more in the middle. I don't know if that was a helpful portrait or not.
I would say it's enough.
Wait. Let me take a stab at it. So the question, ethics, is that you're looking for an example of how the demonstrative would show up within an SEI. Is that right? Given
SEI or any, just pick any type. I am not picky.
so really what an asterisk, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because this is the same way that I see it as well, is that when you have creative and demonstrative, because creative is in a valued slot, right? And again, this is going back to the whole quadra theory that Asterix is talking about, is that obviously that's going to win out. And so while you have, and in this case, SIFE, FI as demonstrative, what's happening there is that there is an oscillation. So you would be able to see a little bit more of it, but it's not going to be as sustained as it would be with somebody that actually has FI as their creative slot. Does that make sense? And when he's talking about the ignoring function, well, I mean, the name says it itself, right? Is that if you have somebody with leading with FE, then FI is going to be less accessible, because think about how that works. If you're leaning into something, then clearly you're leaning out of the other orientation about on it as more, right? And so once you get to creative, there is kind of like this oscillation that goes on where you're zooming in and zooming out, but it's like a boomerang. You're going to fall back into your main programming, which is your ego block. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
I mean, I agree with it.
Yeah, it might be that like my language is not like my first language is English, because like certain words I didn't really get. Like oscillation, like what do you mean by that?
Oscillating just means that you're going back and forth between the two because you need something to, you're kind of like zooming in and zooming out of it, right? But ultimately, it's going to have to go back to your main programming. And again, that's your ego block. It doesn't make sense. So this is where I find Model G like very annoying in terms of the demonstrative function being such a high dimensional function, right? Because let's say that that's true, that it is a high dimensional function. What do you think someone's main programming is going to like resort back to? It's still like the creative function. It doesn't make
All right
sense
then. I
either.
believe I got you. I
Yeah,
believe I got you. So like from what you're pretty much just saying is like no matter how much you try, it will always go back to the let's say main device in a sense. For
right.
example, we take on SLE, for example. They might try to collect many data or whatever they are trying to like find, but in the end, they're gonna either get bored of it or find it redundant or whatever the reasons are, and preferably will go with their, let's say, more valued, stronger functions to kind of like solve their things or like find a way to kind of like do it.
I think that
So
DJ, who was just here and left, probably is. This is a bit meta, but the way in which he was arguing about this topic reflects his own preference for having the pieces fit together. He does this when he's conversing in about modeling, and I've had this kind of conversation with him at other times as well. He's pretty resistant to adapting different pieces of the modeling, and we had a spirited disagreement about some things like this, but I don't think that he like I don't disagree with him when he says he does a lot of information collecting, but it seems rather evident that he and also Jack are more emphatically fitting the available data into the models that they're already thinking about, and it's would be more difficult to get them to shift their their set positions on the modeling, the structure of the things that they're already thinking about, that have sort of already been established. In both of those cases, I don't think they're resistant to collecting new data, but I think they are habitually organizing, and in DJ's case, filtering that data out that doesn't match his preconceptions. And I think this is related to preferring TE over TI. Not in as
like
extreme
it
way
is,
as TI leading, TE ignoring types might do.
yes, I do say it is obvious that like you prefer using your valued functions over your id block, let's say, compared to ego to id. But it's kind of like I don't get how the TE is like, let's say, below average when, let's say, presented to somebody else as an individual in a like, yes, they are not gonna, let's say, be fluent in it or will like demonstrate it in a very like a respectable way, we can say. But can you say that, let's say, the demonstrative function is below average in general? Like, if they are presenting it, they are going to do, let's say, the rudimentary work for it and succeed upon it without any strong complaints or anything like that.
My view is that it's middling in general, below average. When I say below average, I mean below average, but not not unused, slightly below average. I think that's true, and I think that's reasonable. And this is not unlike how it was seen when I was learning about socionics in the mid 2000s. There was very little emphasis on the demonstrative function in writings at the time. Augusta had virtually nothing to say about the demonstrative function in her writing. She had very little to say about the id block at all. So it wasn't really something that we thought about at all, as much. I think some people, thought of it as a strong function, but as a strong function that was kind of more not really so used, more of a middling function than a strong function. I have more of an issue thinking about the ignoring function as a strong function than the demonstrative function, but I think it's more correct to think of the demonstrative function and the role function as middling functions than really strong functions.
Hmm. I would say I'm done with my questions for now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And Blah, as you can see, maybe again, just talking about dimensionality, which you've been pointing out. Other people, the other people in this call have not interpreted dimensionality in the same way as you have. They were asking really strong questions about the demonstrative function as a high dimensional function. This is the standard terminology for this. This is why I'm emphatic about saying that I don't think dimensionality exists. It means something specific.
I get it now. I did not interpret it that same way that everybody else was, apparently. And that's why I was always like wondering why certain people would get typed using their demonstrative function as their base. And I'm like, what the hell are you guys talking about? That makes no sense whatsoever. If that seems to be where their attention gravitates towards more than like 90% of the time, does that make sense that it would be of like an unvalued position? Like, that never made sense to me.
Yeah.
And so
two things to take away from this presentation. One, I disagree with that. This is not part of the theory of quadras. Is not consistent with quadras. Number two, this is a talk also about comparative modeling. There are different approaches in modeling to that question. The presence cube incorporates both quadras and dimensionality. Various other kinds of modeling focus on dimensionality a lot and not in quadras. That's like, I don't know, sort of more Eastern neoclassical modeling. Neo-Eastern modeling does that. School of System Socionics, which is Vladimir Yermak's child, and its direct descendant SCS, the School of Classical Socionics, have basically no emphasis on quadras, and they use dimensionality a lot.
That they don't use that as part of their method of assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to point out that there are a lot of different models, and here are some of the different things that those models point out. And I understand that this talk, which was talked about comparative modeling in socionics, really mostly focuses on Western socionics. That's my bad. I made the event before I started making content for the event and figuring out what I really wanted to put in the event. I should have called it Western socionics.
Yeah. What do you call it? Are you there now?
Sorry,
Did
what?
you have any? Oh, I was asking Matt Rose if he had any questions, since it's really huge on quadras. And so.
No, I don't have a particular question.
Did you understand the information that was presented? Were you around?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
what did you understand?
Oh, go ahead.
What did you understand about it, Matt?
Wait, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I was in and out. I was around my cats.
Yeah, that's fine. But what was your takeaway?
I can't say as much right now. Yeah.
Okay. This is me putting you on the spot, and you always evade.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I have as Blah recommended to me, I made this form where people could submit feedback about the contents of this this presentation. I appreciate any feedback that people have about what was easy to understand, what was difficult to understand. Feel free to look at this Google form and give any feedback on it. And I appreciate that. And I'm happy to take any other questions if anyone has any other questions about modeling.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like a lot of these questions have been asked. So thank you everybody for coming. And again, I appreciate any feedback, and have a good day. Have a good evening, whatever time of day it is, and wherever you are.
Thanks, Astervex.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. Oh, so by the way, ethics, if you're interested in